going to great. I started recording the meeting because I know a few folks aren't able to join us today. So thank you everyone for being part of this meeting as we prepare to do the key assessment reviews for the spring cycle. This is Mary at NAEYC, and just for those who didn't hear me a few minutes ago, I'm showing up as Lauren Hogan in the webinar chat room. So that is me there, in case you were wondering about the NAEYC folks on the call. So today I really wanted to just spend a little bit of time. I don't think we need the whole hour, but just to run through for key assessment reviews, a little bit about the timeline and process, and just to look at the key assessment review instrument as well. And I think, so last week we sent out the notifications for all the Basecamp spaces. So if you have not gotten a notification from Basecamp about your assigned space for reviews, feel free to let me know. Today will be really informal, so I think we'll just keep all the lines open, so just feel free to interrupt throughout if you have questions or want to go back to something that we were talking about. So I will just kind of move through. In the Basecamp spaces, you'll see for each space there are 2 programs in each space and 2 reviewers. And so each of you will serve as the lead reviewer for one of those programs, and then you'll be the co-reviewer for the other program in that Basecamp space. So we've laid out a timeline, a June timeline in terms of conducting the reviews. And June 10th is when we're asking the lead reviewers post their draft feedback in Basecamp. And you'll use that key assessment review instrument that we'll talk about in just a minute. And that'll be your first post in your space where you'll include your recommendations in relation to the questions that are asked in that review instrument. And then we ask the co-panelists that as co-panelists, you'll review that feedback and add in any suggestions you have, or if you have some areas of disagreement, to raise those so that the lead reviewer can look at that and consider those perspectives. And then we're asking on June 21st that as the lead reviewer, you post the final feedback. So at that point, you'll have gone through your co-panelist suggestions and edits to your feedback and incorporated what makes sense there, and you'll post that final feedback in Basecamp. And as staff, we'll then take it from there and do a technical edit of that feedback, and we'll post to you as what we'll be sending to the programs. So you can expect to kind of see that final feedback that's going out to programs as well. I wanted to pause there just in case there's questions about the timeline. And we've built in a little bit of wiggle room, so I shouldn't say that, but we always build in a little bit of wiggle room there so that I know things come up and some unexpected responsibilities come up during that time period, so we provide a little bit more of a leeway for you as well. Any questions about timeline?
Nope, all good.
Okay, I will move on. Just in Basecamp too, we've also added some other resources that you can feel free to use, and as peer reviewers, a lot of these are very familiar to you. We do have guidance. Many programs will submit portfolios, or if they're not called portfolios, a lot of times they will be sort of multi-part assignments. And so we developed this guidance about 1.5 years ago to help peer reviewers and commissioners and programs think about whether that portfolio would serve as a good key assessment. So within that guidance, there's almost sort of a checklist that programs can consider as they sort of evaluate their portfolio against that guidance. So that might be something you want to reference if you have a portfolio that you're reviewing, and whether you find that it does fit well as a key assessment, or if there's some challenges to using that as a key assessment, you could pull some feedback from that guidance to use. We also have the standard document around creating key assessments that align with the standards, as well as the 5 key features of aligned assessment. So again, feel free to use those to help inform your thinking about the key assessments and the quality of that key assessment. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the key assessment review instrument. So for programs, for key assessment reviewers for your program in your Basecamp space, you'll see this instrument there. And this is what you'll use to capture your feedback for the program. And going back to that June 10th deadline where leads posting their feedback, this is the document you'll post on June 10th with your feedback on your key assessment. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback on here. I wonder if to mute lines, and let's see if that helps with the echo. Great, thank you. So there's two parts to the key assessment review instrument. The first page of this document really focuses on the quality of the key assessment. And so it's looking at rubric quality, looking at labeling, looking at the language in the key assessments, whether it's clear, objective, qualitative language that's used in the key assessment versus subjective, vague language that's used in the key assessment. So that's the focus of the first section of the key assessment review. And then the second, I'm going to move my slide, is really focused on the alignment of that key assessment to the standards. So you'll find on the first, I'll go back, so on the first section on key assessment, the quality of the key assessment, your role, your evaluation really is to think about how strongly you agree or disagree with the statements around whether labeling is appropriately used in the key assessment, et cetera. And you can include some comments in there, and as we do with our peer reviewing and with the commission, we really try to take a strengths-based approach so that when we're seeing programs with strong key assessments, we really want to note where they're doing that well, and then we point to programs back to that if we're seeing concerns in those areas, so that they have some examples within their own key assessments of where they're doing it well, and they can apply that then to maybe some areas that need some more development. And likewise with the areas of alignment, again, as reviewers, it's to really indicate whether you're finding alignment with that key assessment or whether you're seeing some challenges as it relates to alignment. So I'll just pause there. I didn't know if there were questions about the format of the key assessment review. And throughout this. Just in terms of the labeling and some of the other pieces within the that we're looking at in the key assessment review instrument, again, this should also be very familiar as peer reviewers, but we've had questions, as this will be our fourth cycle of doing the key assessment reviews, and so kind of some of the typical questions that crop up as we hear from peer reviewers is around the labeling. We ask that programs label where they're identifying, where they're addressing the standards and key elements within their key assessment. So a lot of times with the key assessment, programs they'll put at the very beginning of their key assessment which standards and key elements they're addressing, and they'll also embed it within the key assessment. And so that's fine to do that. But the most important piece is to make sure that that within the assessments, both the student instructions as well as the rubrics, that they label within those where they're addressing the standards and key elements. So again, sometimes we get questions of, is it okay if they put the standards and elements at the front of their key assessments? That's fine, so long as they're also embedding it within the instructions and rubrics. Any questions about that, Pete?
No.
Okay. And then on the key assessment review instrument itself, so row 4 is asking about, is there consistency between what's being asked of the candidates in the student instructions and also what's being evaluated in the rubric? And so again, that's just making sure that as they lay out the instructions, that what's laid out in the instructions is also being evaluated in the rubrics. Sometimes we find with key assessments that the rubrics might be much more expensive than the student instructions, and that is okay, but there needs to be a reference for the student instructions to what is being measured and evaluated in the rubrics. And so, just to kind of look for that consistency, and that the same thing that's being asked in the student instructions is being evaluated in the rubrics. Sometimes we'll see some differentiation in terms of the rubrics say that one particular piece is being measured, but it actually is something that the candidates are told to do something else in the student instructions. So again, we're just making sure that there's a good match between the instructions and the rubrics. And again, you've heard this as if you're an accredited program or if you are a peer reviewer, but also really looking at the rubrics to make sure that there's qualitative and distinctive candidate performance expectations. So, making sure that the language is focused on qualitative language and that it's not solely quantitative in terms of they need to submit 3 examples of assessments that they would use with the students, but that they really explain, go further, and it might be that ask the candidate to select 3 assessments they would use with a young child, explain why they chose that, what are the benefits of that particular assessment, what are some of the challenges with that assessment. So again, to ask them in the rubrics to make sure that they are really being specific in the rubrics, making sure that it's really focused on the qualitative language of the standard rather than quantitative language. And making sure that there's a real difference in terms of student performance expectations at each level that's addressed within the rubrics. As you've seen as peer reviewers, sometimes with key assessments, we see rubric columns that might be have developing, progressing, meeting, exceeding, and so making sure that it's really clear that if they're using developing and progressing, is the program clear with us about whether that's meeting or not meeting the standards? What we're looking for as peer reviewers is to make sure that there's that clear distinction between what meets the standard and what doesn't meet the standard.
And this is a really good one to look at too, because I've seen so many times the rubrics are not really observable, describable, qualitative. They may not use weak or excellent, but there's very little differentiation between the various columns. So you have to look really carefully to see what they're doing there.
And from our purposes, from the accreditation, we're really focused on that distinction between met and not met. Many and most programs include an exceeds column, and that's fine. But again, our focus is really on making sure that there's that distinction between met and not met, and to make sure the language within the rubrics, on those, to your point, it's just really focused on that qualitative language, the observable language, like what are the tasks that candidates have to do to show that they are meeting that standard. And I think I've already touched on this in terms of making sure that there are really clear performance categories for each of those rules. And then sometimes programs will use points within the rubrics, and that is fine. We're agnostic with programs about whether they use points or not within their rubrics. We do provide feedback, though, to them, because many programs will provide large point ranges. Oh, I'm hearing some feedback again, sorry. So we can just mute the line. And so sometimes programs will use really large point ranges in the columns, and that makes it really difficult for the candidates to know what they need to do in order to be successful in that column. It also provides, if there are multiple faculty that are evaluating candidates using this rubric, that it opens it up for wide interpretation about why someone gets 20 points versus 10 points within that point range. So we do provide some feedback to programs just about point ranges, but if they are going to use those, we really recommend smaller point ranges and being very clear, how someone would earn the points within that point range. And then as we move into the alignment issues, let me see if I move in here. Oops, here we go. Okay, so as we move into that second page of the key assessment review instrument, that's the piece that's really focused on alignment. And here's where we ask the peer reviewers that we really go back to the standards and look at that full supporting explanation for each of the standards to make sure that the key assessments are measuring the breadth and depth of that standard. And so really just using that, the supporting explanation, have that next to us as we're going through the key assessments, just to make sure that the key assessments that the program submitted are really getting at that full supporting explanation and addressing what's in there. And I've talked a little bit about portfolios and the guidance that we offer on portfolios, the guidance document that we release. And then we also provide feedback to programs on whether it's a group project. Sometimes in key assessments, they are a group project, or part of that key assessment is a group project. So we also provide feedback to programs to make sure that if that's the case, that they are assessing individual candidate performance in those key assessments. So that also might be something if you have a key assessment that has a group project element to it, just to provide some feedback to the program if it's not clear in the rubric of making sure that they're assessing individual student performance in those key assessments. We've talked about this piece. I will not run through, unless someone would find it helpful, that the 5 key features of aligned key assessment. But again, this really gets at making sure the tasks that are being asked are really addressing that full breadth and depth of the standards themselves. And this kind of gets at the example that I was talking about earlier, where in the red box here, this is a really quantitative measure that the candidate selects 3 good assessment tools. And really what we want to think about is making sure that the rubric is asking them to not just select 3 assessment tools, but really to talk about the rationale, the goals of the assessment, and making sure candidates can demonstrate that they know the benefits and harms of the assessment in order to get at really the full breadth and depth of 3A, for example. Would it be, I'll pause here to see if there's questions on what we're looking for in the key assessment review instruments, and if there's further clarity we could provide in the different rows on that feedback tool. Okay.
No.
All right.
We're good.
Y'all are an easy audience, so.
Well, the tone is very clear and very helpful. So.
So I think, as you are going through your Basecamp spaces, for those who have done site visits within an EYC, it should feel very familiar because we're using the same platform that we do to help organize our site visits and the work. And so feel free to communicate with your co-panelists through the Basecamp site. For those who are new to Basecamp, feel free to be in touch with me if you'd like just a one-on-one demo of using Basecamp. We're happy to walk through that piece of it. And I encourage you, again, as the kind of the first step as you review your program is to fill out that key assessment review instrument, and that's what you'll be posting on Basecamp as sort of your first round of feedback on the programs. And then your co-panelists can then do the secondary review just to see if they have anything to add to what you've already found within the program. Are there any questions about the process or timeline that I can answer at this time?
No, I think I've got it.
Okay. All right. Well, I thank you so much for contributing to the accreditation system in this way. And I know that you are either in the midst of or have just finished up one of the busiest times of the year. So I really appreciate you taking this on as well. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions during this process. If you're going to be at June PLI, I look forward to seeing you there. And I hope that you have a good rest of your day today.
Thank you, Mary, for all the support you give us through this process. It's appreciated.
All right, well, we are indebted to all of you, so I really appreciate it. And, you know, please, we're here to help, so please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
All right, well, take care, everyone.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye, ladies.